Hey, this is like take 27 because I can't get this right. I am presenting to you today as my educational influencer, Howard Zinn. So from now on, Howard Zinn. All right, let's go. All right, Howard Zinn. God, this guy, Howard Zinn. Me. I'm Howard Zinn. I I've worn many hats in my lives. I've had many titles. I've gone from soldier, student, professor, writer, playwright, activist, historian, Jew. People have labeled me a Marxist, a communist, a socialist, a democratic socialist. Um, I guess like I can't list all those things without telling you more about my life. I was born in 1922 to two working class Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn, New York. 1922, a lot of stuff happening in the world. World War One ended, Great Depression starting, stock market going into kicked a little bit. Cats are running around. Graduated from Thomas Edison High School in Brooklyn in 1940. From 18 to 21, nothing. It was kind of impending doom. We knew we were going to war again. So I was actually working in the New York Navy shipyard from 18 to 21. By the time I turned 21, World War II was in full effect. So I enlisted with the Army Air Force. I spent 2 years as a bombardier with the 490th Bombardier Corps. During the end of the time of the war in Europe, one of my final fly-throughs, we were testing new weapons. We weren't dropping bombs so much anymore. We weren't shooting down. It wasn't as much air fight in Europe as so much over Japan and in the Southern Pacific. They had us test out what they called this jelly gasoline. In later years, we would call it napalm. We used it a lot in Vietnam. It decimated tens to hundreds of square miles. It just burned. One of my last flights, they had us testing this, and we flew over Royal, France, and we dropped this jelly gasoline over, burning and killing more than half the population. It wasn't until later that we found out that Royal, France was full of nothing but civilians, and I took it to heart. I'd spend the rest of my life being kind of known as a pacifist. I had a lot of anti-war stances that stemmed from this one event, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later. But after I got out, I used my GI Bill to go to New York University. There, I received a BA in history, and then in 1951, I transferred to Columbia University, where I got my PhD, in history, and I got a minor in poli-sci. I graduated about 1956. I know by the beginning of 1956, my first teaching opportunity came up at Spelman College. I would be a professor of history. Spelman College is historically known as the oldest private liberal college for Black women in the U.S. At that time, it was still a big thing. And me being this little white Jewish guy teaching history, it was great. Spent 6 years there. Throughout those 6 years, though, I actually got really involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known historically as SNCC, SNCC. There, I served as an advisor, so I did a lot of traveling from Atlanta to Alabama to Mississippi, and I'd sit in on a lot of meetings. And that's where I started a lot of my writing. I actually wrote a lot of journals, and I'd send them to things like Harper's and The Nation. So that's where my first writing really took off. The end of my sixth academic school year, I was actually fired from my position in Spelman due to insubordination. They said the dismissal came because I was radicalizing the students. I use these because in my paper, in the paper that other kid wrote, he used quotation marks. Okay. Moving on. In this time, I took 2 years off. I was heavily involved with SNCC. I actually wrote my first book called SNCC, The New Abolitionist. That's where my stuff went from journals and newspapers to first hardcover. So that was first big writing. 1964, I accepted a role as professor of political science in Boston U. Um, it was that same year, SNCC and civil rights movement was kind of going crazy. So I was traveling. I'm sorry, traveling. I was traveling from Boston to Mississippi and Alabama a lot. Um, I started developing a program with SNCC to have like 200 plus volunteers. SNCC civil rights workers continue their education while they were involved in the movement. That was something that was really big for me. I also participated in what was called the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, riding around on buses trying to help out other younger student activists. This involved around 1,000 student activists helping coordinating various activist roles for the civil rights. During this time, I also wrote my second book, which was titled The Southern Mystique. It was based on the struggle for civil rights. Back to my academic career. I spent 24 years at Boston U. All my classes were on civil liberties and civil justice, and every semester they were packed 400 students, just seating capacity. The funny part about this, at Boston University, most of my classes weren't required for any degree. They were just open-minded students who wanted to learn and be educated and try to feel struggles, try to understand struggles a little bit more. I retired from BU in 1988. During my tenure, though, at BU, I wrote tons of journals and books with things about my experience in World War II, my opinions on war, just cause. One of my earlier ones was a lot of people would say it's one of my biggest ones. It's called The Logical Withdrawal. That was in 1967 when Vietnam was at its height. I'm gonna skip because I wrote a lot of stuff. My biggest one, the one that people know my name from, is called A People's History of the United States. I wrote it in 1980. It's described as a side of American history that can largely be seen as the exploitation and manipulation of the majority by rigged systems that hugely favor a small aggregate. Oh my God, the kid that wrote this. Why the big words? Favor a small aggregate of elite rulers from across orthodox political parties. Okay, layman's terms, I wrote about the dirty side of American history that no one wanted to say, no one wanted to teach. I wrote about Columbus's genocide and enslavement of natives in the Bahamas. I wrote about the trials of Chinese and Irish immigrants during the westward expansion. I wrote about the genocide of Native American nations. Just the dirty, gritty things that no one wanted to learn, that no one wanted to teach, I guess, so much. Newer versions, since I wrote it in 1980, newer versions have come out. I've updated it. I have given it different formats to teach different grades. I've made a version for younger readers, as well as we turned it into a graphic novel for enthusiasts, just to get more information out. In 2008, a project that I put my name to, the Zinn Education Project, was established to support educators using the book in their middle school and high school classrooms. So that was cool. Even after my retirement from academia, I still wrote journals and continued to write books. My anti-war stances continued as well. When Desert Storm happened in the 90s, I was one of the first to say we had no right to initiate war. I'd bring up things like the U.S. breaking UN charter and the Arab states surrounding Iraq that didn't want any part of the war. I'd go on to blame presidents for their hand in ongoing war and chastise them for not putting a stop to it. Throughout the 90s, I wrote all the time. 95, I wrote a book, Hiroshima, Breaking the Silence, which was based on targeting civilians and aerial bombing, 1999, I wrote well, by 99, I wrote 3 plays. The biggest one was Marx in Soho. And it was about Karl Marx, one person play about Karl Marx, who it put a more civilian light to him, showing that he was like a family man supporting his wife and kids. It's my most well-known play. By 2002, I wrote my memoir, which is called You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. That was made into a documentary that Matt Damon, who ended up turning into a good friend of mine late in my life, narrated. It went through growing up in Brooklyn, fighting for the country, fighting against leaders for our country, and standing up for what is right for the betterment of society. My memoir. My writings influence a lot of people. Hollywood picked it up. In Good Will Hunting, Robin Williams' character actually taught from my book, and Matt Damon and Ben Affleck would acknowledge me when they received their Oscar later that well, which was cool. I died. I died in 2010 of a heart attack. Don't feel bad though, because I died in a big Southern California house sitting outside in right next to my pool. So I led a good life. People describing me in the 90s and 2000 always said, well, he's something of an anarchist. He's something of a socialist. Maybe a democratic socialist? I wonder who we hear that about. But I led a great life. I was an influential writer, a noble activist, and a critical historian. I feel like I provided great information, and I've given a lot for people to think about as our nation grows older. Yeah, I'm gonna just cut it off there. I don't know what the time limit was. Thanks for watching. If you like my content, subscribe down low, or click right there. Or maybe you might like this too. In YouTube Talk, I'd have something popping up here, but I'm done.